Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us get straight underway because we don't have all that long for this session. And as I say, we are focusing here to make sure you're in the right room. It's like when you're on an aeroplane and you wait for them to hear them say, "Welcome to the flight to Brussels." This is the session on the road to ERA implementation. And as we heard from the Minister in the last session, the Council adopted the ERA roadmap at national level in May, and now, as she said it, the building blocks are in place. We need to complete the European research area. So that's what I want to focus on in this session. Let me introduce our speakers. We have with us Dr. Agrita Chiopa, Deputy State Secretary for Higher Education, Science and Innovation in the Ministry of Education and Science in Latvia. A very warm welcome to you. Next to me, Professor Helena Vaz de Carvalho Nazare, who is President of the European University Association. Thank you for being here. On the other side, Amanda Crowfoot, who is Director of Science Europe, and stepping into the breach, ladies and gentlemen, at the very much 11th hour. Unfortunately, Stefania Giannini, Minister for Education in Italy, couldn't be with us. She had to cancel because of an urgent matter in Italy today. So Ian Cameron, Dr. Ian Cameron, Head of Research Careers and Diversity at Research Councils UK, has not only agreed, he already had a job today. His job was to be the rapporteur on this session, in the session that will follow. He's now also playing the role of panelist, so I will ask him to be very schizophrenic. And in this session, give us his views, and in the next session, share with us the collective views of the room when we bring the other two groups back together. So, the format for this session, I want to dive in. We have a lot to discuss, so I've asked our panel not to make opening remarks. We're just going to dive straight in and really focus. If the building blocks are in place, what do we need to do? What are the main challenges that we will need to address now to deliver on those priorities that are set out in the roadmap and make sure that it maximises its contribution to this new start that we've been talking about? Perhaps, Agrita, you could give us a thought on how you see the main challenges.
Well, thank you very much.
Pull the microphone towards you.
Yes, thank you. I think the main challenge is not just doing something, but doing the right thing. And here, if we look at those building blocks or those priorities that we outlined in the ERA roadmap, we see that, let's say, 3 of them are for researchers to change their practices. That's about tech transfer, that's about gender equality, and that's about the international science, and the rest 5 of those are for policymakers to set up incentives, to set up policies, to do things, from our side. And even the 3 that we left for scientists are somewhat connected to what we have to do. So therefore, for ourselves, we've been questioning, so how do we go about it? How do we understand the concepts, as it was mentioned in the last sessions, that lie behind those issues? And for me, there are 2 things on the table. One is the very nature of knowledge, which is like a coin with 2 sides. At one side, there is this explicit side. At the other side, it's a tacit side. About the explicit, everything is kind of clear. We make it open, we publish, we share, we transfer. Then what about the explicit side? So how do we go about it? How do we think about it? How do we sort of keep in mind that that part of knowledge is embedded in people? And that's where the other thing comes in importance, is that the people, when we talk about scientists and researchers, are not only people themselves and their knowledge, what they know and what they've learned, but also their networks and how they acquire those networks through their projects, through their lifetime experiences. And one thing we did for ourselves is we put the university, I would say, back in the picture at the level of the prominence it should have, because that's where we generate our human capital. That's where people make their connections. That's where they are or are not connected with industries.
Okay, thank you. And already beginning there to identify the different roles of the different players in this, which I'd very much like to come back to in the discussion. But Helena Nazare, from your point of view, the most important challenges, the most difficult things we need to do if we are to achieve full implementation and move to the next chapter.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. Good morning. I would say that we still have a lot of fragmentation at the policy level and at the funding level, both at European Commission level, at the country level, even inside the country at the different ministries level. So I am calling for more integration and better use of that integration to pursue our politics. The other thing is that we have heard about memories and about dreams. I would say that one of our memories is our diversity, and we should really use our diversity as a leverage to our dreams. So universities, European universities, the panorama is very diverse. Let's use it. Let's not destroy it. The other thing that is really worrying me is that I've heard a lot about innovation related mostly to technological innovation. And perhaps we should mention social and organizational innovation. Because in the end of the day, it's the people, it's persons that deal with innovations, it's not machines. Yeah. And again, the other thing that has been mentioned already, and I think it's important for the universities, is to promote a risk-taking culture, avoiding punishing failure. Now, last one for me is that we need, at all levels, simple but effective regulation. And I'm just going to give you an example. Carlos Moedas, the Commissioner, yesterday talked about 4 priorities, 4 important issues. One of them is food, the other one was health. Both of these issues need regulation, simple but effective. Examples: food, genetics. So we need simple but effective regulations. And we do not need to be so much afraid of the boogeyman when it comes to privacy issues and all that thing about open science, open data.
Okay, thank you very much. On that, we again lots to come back to in the discussion. But Ian Cameron, from your perspective, at this stage, what do you see as the biggest obstacles, biggest challenges?
Okay, I think in answering that, I reflect on the way we tend to do things in the UK, actually. In a sense, the biggest challenge, really, I think, is to have researchers in universities able to focus on their ideas. It's creating that ecosystem that really enables them to have the ideas, develop the ideas, ultimately those ideas and the people flowing through into other parts of the economy. And I think in the UK, we absolutely focus, as was said yesterday, on excellence of the research, the excellence of the training, the excellence in all we do is absolutely the core. But then we focus on thinking, well, have we got the boundaries between the disciplines right? I mean, that's a problem. How do people effectively work across those boundaries? How do people effectively work across the boundaries between, as in the UK, most research is done in the universities. How do you manage that boundary with the rest of the economy, with businesses? And that comes down to people, training, developing new generations of talented people who can actually effectively talk across the boundary. Because talking to other academics is one thing, talking to people in industry and business who don't necessarily know where you're coming from is rather different. And also taking the ideas with them. And so you need people who can do that, you need people who can manage that. All those things have to come together, I think.
So for you, that session that's going on in a parallel room about the skills of a modern researcher is an absolutely fundamental issue and plays back to something Robert Jan Smit was talking about yesterday evening when he said we haven't focused yet on the multidisciplinary nature of all this. So it's across boundaries between disciplines, but also university, business, etc., as we were talking about earlier. Thank you again. Things to come back to later on. But Amanda Crowfoot, same challenges for you, or are there things, is there a gap in our discussion so far?
Well, I mean, I do certainly agree with a number of things that the other panellists have said, but I mean, for me, I think the biggest challenge is about getting the balance right between a number of potentially conflicting elements. I think the first one of these is that we have to accept that across Europe there are varying degrees of research capacity, and we have to find a way to basically bring up the less well-performing regions and countries and so on without having reforms that mean we actually damage what's good and what's working well in other places. This links to the whole debate about diversity. I mean, this has been mentioned a lot already, the idea that diversity is one of Europe's strengths. But also, we do know there are areas where there is fragmentation and we do need harmonisation. So we have to get that balance right of harmonising where it's appropriate, but also making sure we don't damage the diversity and we don't over-harmonise to the point that we do have no diversity anymore. The next area where I think we need to look at the balance is related really to the degree of urgency of action. I've heard already this morning a few times people talking about, you know, the urgency for action. And whilst I'm not denying this or disputing this, I think we have to make sure that we're taking the right action. And I think very clearly what we do has to be evidence-based. It has to be the right reforms, the right regulations, the right actions to make a long-term, sustainable European research area. So I think I would just caution a bit that we need to balance this need for urgency with the need to actually get it right. There's no point doing it quickly and getting it wrong. And my final point is about the balance between research and innovation. Now, again, we all know that they're interlinked. Research is a crucial element of the innovation cycle. But I think, coming back to what others have said, if we focus all the time on technological innovation, I think we're losing something there. And I think that we have to remember that whilst not all innovation is related to research, research also has things that are wider than innovation. And we have to make sure that we're not losing the importance of the cultural, the societal, the basic research aspects of research by packaging it up in a kind of innovation agenda.
Okay, thank you very much. A tricky balance in three key areas. Perhaps we can discuss how to achieve that. I just want to ask the panel just a few more questions, but I very much do want to come out to all of you very soon to begin to collect your ideas, your thoughts on how we meet these challenges that our panel have identified, or indeed any other challenges you think they've missed out. But I want to come back to really where Agrita started, which is in question of who does what. Because we can all talk about we need to create an excellent this and we need to do a marvellous that. But in the end it comes down to who is going to do what. And we have here representatives of member states, we have representatives of universities. So my question really is, starting perhaps with the role of the member states. The minister said it's up to member states now to mobilise their efforts through the national action plans and strategies. Of course, those national action plans, we have a few already, but they're due by the middle of 2016. How do you see the role of member states, and how important do you believe this strengthened sense of ownership that the Council has talked about, saying that will be vital if we're really going to make a difference? What is the key role now for those action plans? What do they need to contain to make it work? Who would like to come in first? Ian, a thought on that, if you would?
Okay. Almost rather than content, I might just talk about process a little bit, because I think process is really important here, because the UK, we were involved formally as in the rapporteuring the development of the ERA roadmap. And I think that it's the sort of consultative process you go through and the engagement of different organisations is really important, because actually that reflects what we do in the UK, because we might, I mean, you might look at the UK and think it's quite a big place. Actually, we think it's quite a small place. It's very easy for us to get the right people together from the university side, from the research funding side, the government side, the actual players in the universities. We know each other. We have a long history of working together, and actually it's really important that you bring those different perspectives together, because I think we all understand that the roadmap, as being said earlier, it's got six headings, 8 priorities in it. Actually, some of those actually we feel we've done already. Other ones we need to focus on. There's no point in us focusing on the ones that we believe are done. We want to do the ones that will move us forward. So there's a national interest in this too.
So the key role here for member states is that convening capacity as much as anything else.
I think that's right, because they understand what can work and what will work in their own countries, and bring that forward.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts in terms of the national action plans and strategies and what member states need to do? Greta, you began to outline, you talked about incentives was one of the areas I think you mentioned as a policy maker area, and we've talked quite a lot about yesterday incentives for open science and so on. What do you see as the key role for these national action plans? How can we make sure they do deliver on the priorities?
Well, I guess I would start with thinking how do national action plans take up those issues that have been discussed and put on the priority list. And as colleagues mentioned already, some of the priorities are already for a long time in the national action plans. Some of them are not there yet, but the discussion is what actually makes things to move, where people internalize what has been put in a paper. And I would see that the platforms for discussion that we have created in a framework of smart specialization strategy is also a good platform where to use, which can be used to move this agenda forward. For example, if we are discussing bioeconomy as one of Latvian platforms, smart specialization platforms, we can then discuss the issues that are related to open science in this particular ecosystem, between those players, with their connections within the country and across the border. And in that way, I think, we usually used to think in terms of streamlining the gender issues, where we can streamline the policy issues and get them in different policies that are in place.
That alignment question, which is so crucial. Helena and Amanda, I mean, I want to come back in a moment. You're both your organisations are members of the stakeholder platform. We'll come back to your role in all of this in a moment. But in terms of the role of the member states and what they need to do, what do they need to do for you, if I can put it that way? Amanda first, and then Helena.
I'd say, in terms of what the member states need to do for us as an organisation, as a collection of research funding and performing organisations, is basically have dialogue. Because essentially, as Ian said, the importance of the national agendas, the national programmes, and the member states is that they know what's happening in each of the 28 member states. It's about getting strong national systems in place, which you need if you're going to build up a strong European system. And I think that as part of that, there needs to be a really good dialogue between the member states in terms of the governments and the national capabilities at the level of research organisations. And actually, I think the new roadmap is a very, very good start. I think the fact that there's been a lot more iteration between the different stakeholders than there has been in previous policy developments is really, really positive. And I think the fact that the new ERA roadmap focuses on a small number of priorities that everybody buys into and everybody feels we can make progress towards is really important.
So that focus to deliver maximum impact. Helena, from your point of view, and I'm taking Monty Python completely out of context, what can ministers do for you, if I can put it that way, the member state level? We'll come to the European level later, but what do you want from the member states to deliver on implementation?
Well, first is to recognize that universities are one of the oldest institutions in Europe. Okay, we are Titanics. But that is in the way the ministers think about us. But the ministers think about universities as they were when they were students. Universities are no longer that way. So perhaps I would start by that. Actually, at the moment, universities educate citizens. We educate the next generation of people that are going out there and work and innovate. So that's one of the things that I would like my minister to do.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Coming to your role, and Amanda, I'd like to ask you something very specific here relating to this new charter. You've been very involved in developing a new charter for access to infrastructures. I mentioned the stakeholder platform earlier. I'd like to get some impressions from both of you. How do you see your role in helping to address the barriers, and if you could say 2 words about this new charter and what it is trying to do, and then Helena, if you could talk a little bit more about the stakeholder platform, how well it works, whether improvements could be made.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, the European Charter on Access to Research Infrastructures is something which we've, over the last few years, been very closely involved in the development of. But not just Science Europe, also the European Commission, ESFRI, all the other stakeholders, a whole range of different organisations. And so I think it is an excellent example where if you do put everybody together at all the different levels, you can come up with something that's actually really useful for the research community and has very practical benefits. What the Charter is essentially a set of common standards and sort of harmonised rules, entirely non-binding, but there's basically there to support access to research infrastructures and those who provide access to research infrastructures. So it's a very short, very flexible, very easy to use document that sets out a number of key principles about the access to research infrastructures and also proposes some guidelines. So as I say, that they're non-binding, they're entirely there intended to be kind of use to the research community. But I think the very fact that everybody who needed to be involved was involved, and we went through a very kind of detailed iterative process to get to the end guidelines, makes them something that's kind of very useful and is, as I say, a really good example of that collaboration.
And if I could just follow up, do you draw lessons from that about, we've talked a lot about the importance of continuing, as you say, a concrete example of bringing people together and what you can do. Do you draw lessons from that process about how to do that in relation to other issues, not just the access for infrastructures, and how to make sure stakeholder organisations play that role you're describing?
I think, I mean, really, I mean, without sort of identifying individual issues, I think really stakeholders need to be involved in all of these issues. I mean, there's nothing, if I look at the ERA roadmap, if I look at the ERA agenda, there's nothing in there that's not relevant to research funding organisations or performing organisations or universities. So I think we have to be involved in all of the discussion. I think the other lesson I would say that we learnt from it is that it was quite a lengthy process in developing this charter, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think that meant that what we came out with at the end is something that we felt we'd got right and everybody was happy with that was involved in the process. And so, you know, I think it was a very positive experience. I mean, there's still the possibility for evolution of the Charter. You know, we certainly will revisit it over time. It may evolve over time. But, you know, the fact is it's a very practical thing that's there now on the Commission website that can be used.
Okay, thank you very much. And Elena, I mean, this idea of reinforced partnership, of course, not new. 2012 Commission communication giving you that explicit role. The stakeholder platform is the sort of physical sign of that. How well is it working, and how do you see your role now and in the future?
Okay, obviously, having started by avoiding fragmentation, I would now support the platform. It's the obvious way to the future. Now, what have we done to support development? We have, together with within our membership, tried to discover good practices of collaboration between universities and business. Okay, so now we have evidence of what works and what does not work in bringing these two partners together. So I think that's what it's the real advantage of working at European level, but with different actors. Again, in the cases of open science and open data, we have identified the challenges. And let me give you a very small little example. The way that open access, open data, influences promotion within academia. It's a tiny thing. We have talked about that. We have discussed that. Again, how universities together with companies can we promote research integrity? And for me, that is a real key issue. It's better not to have any data open at all than having the wrong data being used to further developments. So this is a very important and key issue.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Ian, from your point of view, the role of the stakeholder organisations is the process as we have it now. You said process is very important. Can there be any improvements to that process from a stakeholder organisation perspective?
I'm sure there can always be improvements in process. I think. I think actually the way we make it better is by having more informed stakeholders. I mean, the more we share the ideas and share what is important, the more we can actually develop our. I'm speaking here like from a research council.
Sure.
We interact with our government department. I mean, when the ideas for what needs to be done don't come down to us, they go up from the research councils. We're capturing stuff. It's the ways in which you capture all that development of knowledge, because it's sort of about, you're trying to keep the processes broadly the same, but actually keep bringing a new flow of ideas, the new change coming into that, and make sure that is applied, because otherwise you run the risk of having priorities which don't connect to what, say, an individual academic in a university might say. I think that connection is really important.
And interesting you say that, because a word we talked about a lot yesterday was the bottom-up. It has to be driven that way round. It cannot be driven the other way round. Greta, from your perspective, what do you want, if I can put it that way, from the stakeholder organisations, speaking from a ministry perspective, a government perspective, what do you need from them to complete implementation of ERA? And then I want to ask you all about the role of the European Union in all of this, and then I'm going out to all of you.
Well, probably I would raise the level of expectation about the time, understanding that that we are not talking about development of future citizens or future employees or future entrepreneurs, but that we are talking about today, that we actually, as people grow, as they learn, they already are part of the society, and they already produce something, and they already innovate. And that shift in the mindset, first of all, in academia, in research, and also in outside world. And, you know, if we understand the time dimension and start being together, working together, being in the same place, then I think we already done something, and that's not easy.
Okay, thank you. Before I go out to the audience, a thought on where the EU sits in all of this. We now have the European roadmap for the European research area. In terms of supporting member states, supporting stakeholder organisations in now delivering on implementation, what do you need them to do? I see Peter is sitting, listening avidly, and I'm sure we'll start scribbling furiously as you come up with your wish list, your dreams of how they can support this process, having set the goals, if you like, they've set the priorities. Are those priorities clear enough? Do we need more clarity at all? Do you need other help in terms of guidelines for implementation? What do you see their role as now? Thoughts on that, and then out to all of you. Who would like to go first? Amanda? Yeah.
I think a really crucial role for the EU is one, essentially, it is a coordination role. It is a kind of platform for everybody to communicate. I mean, if you take the example of the stakeholders platform that we've just been talking about, you know, the European Commission is a partner in that platform, and they have a really important role in kind of convening the rest of us, providing a platform for us to have these discussions. So I think that ability to kind of almost be a neutral facilitator between the 28 member states and all the different stakeholders is a really important one. I also think that it's very important when we look at the role of the EU to look at it in terms of complementarity with what happens at national level. I mean, we've talked a lot about avoidance of duplication, and I think really the EU systems shouldn't be there to duplicate the 28 national systems. So if we take, for example, Horizon 2020, Horizon 2020 is hugely important and hugely successful, but it's successful and important on the basis of subsidiarity, on the basis of something over and above what is done at national level and slightly different to what's done at national level, be that about capacity in terms of funding things of a size that can't be funded nationally, or bringing together kind of partnerships that can't be brought together nationally for whatever reasons. So I think it's that kind of, the sort of dual roles, if you like, of coordination and complementarity.
Thank you very much. From a member state perspective, Greta, what do you want from the EU now, building on what's been done? You move from presidency hot seat, being the EU, to being a member state implementing in this area. What's the role of the EU now as you see it?
I would say leaving enough wiggle room for member states to experiment and to do their things. And I think we as one of the EU 13 countries, we experienced the whole exercise of smart specialization, where we were asked to specialize. But at the same time, we all understand clearly it's about smart diversification, and especially in the regions that are over-specialized already. So to have that wiggle room and have that support in finding the voice of each and single player in diverse Europe, that's probably what we would expect from the EU. And on more sort of practical terms, I think that harmonization of systems and taking in account the national ways, and also probably sometimes not letting national ways prevail if the incentives they produce are wrong. That's probably where a lot of effort should be put in.
So helping, as the Commissioner said yesterday, you need to know when it's not working and try something else. That's where the EU can help. Helena, from your point of view, the role of the EU now?
Well, not only supporting the changes and supporting the extra funds that all the stakeholders need to deliver, but also to join efforts themselves. When the different director generals work together, they deliver best. And again, the joint venture between the Director General for Research and Innovation together with the Director General for the regions, it's a very good example of when they join together, they deliver best. So for us, for the European universities, we are trying to build tunnels that connect the different silos. And we ask the European Commission to do the same. Talk together and maximize whatever they can do to support us.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian, from your perspective.
I think I agree with all that's been said. I think that coordinating things is a really good role. I think recognising actually that there are really good things happening in member states, and there are different things in different member states. Yeah. So I think there's an element of listening, because I was very conscious sometimes that what the Commissioner says about the things that Europe needs to do, about having good research, but actually getting good innovation and getting good impact from it, exactly the things that we talk about in the UK as well. I'm sure it's exactly the sort of things that Germany talks about, other countries too. And I think the point is that we actually know, a lot of us collectively, we know the things we need to know. We know the system, we sort of understand it. What we have to do is not invent new things now, and we have to really focus on it and make it all work. Okay. I mean, I do have an example in the UK. I mean, we talk about, often in the UK, about having 1% of the world's population, but 3% of the research. Then when you come to the papers, it's something like 8%. But when you look at the impact of the papers, it's even higher, something like 15%. Those sort of messages, getting that out, and to have everybody thinking, how do you really make that work? That really works for us.
Okay. So don't reinvent the wheel. Look what's out there, look what's working, share best practice, act as a convener for that as well. I want to come out to all of you and get your, as I say, it doesn't have to just be questions. We really do want to hear your thoughts, your ideas on how we move ahead with this, where you see the challenge, whether any challenges that have not been mentioned at all that you think we really need to focus on. Anybody have a question or indeed a comment to what they've heard? Who can I lure anybody in to kick us off? Please, and if you could introduce yourself and please be brief. Thank you, sir.
Vincent Rayon from the European Parliamentary Research Service. The initiative for ERA was launched in 2000 and we are in 2015. With a new roadmap for implementation. Some stakeholders have said that there's nothing new under the sun and called for EU legislation on ERA. So I wanted the point of view of the different stakeholders on the opportunity for legislation.
Okay, I like the way you put the opportunity for legislation. That's quite a big question, so I'm happy to go straight back to the panel unless anybody wants to come in. Let's tackle that head on. are there gaps? Is it legislation we need? I think member states, when you look at council conclusions, have pretty clearly said they don't see that as the area of focus. For you, are there gaps? Do we need new legislation? Anyway, who would like to come in? I see you smiling, Helena, a slightly wry smile. What is your thought here? Is it about, have we got the tools and instruments we need? Do we need new ones?
We might try to invent new tools, but certainly legislation will not help. At most, it will stifle whatever happens in the different member states. Don't believe really in legislations. It tries to uniformize, make everything equal.
Other thoughts on that, Ian?
I'm just thinking of the example I gave a minute ago of how you get really good impact from the research you fund. We can change that in the UK, but it doesn't happen with legislation. It's by persuading people that it's really important, that you need to do what you can to actually really make that impact. And it's about getting your profile up in research terms and actually really being very visibly doing something with the research. You don't need legislation to do that. You need organisations working together, working with the academic sector, working with business to make it all work.
Amanda?
Thank you. I mean, I think that, exactly as Ian says, a lot of these things need to be done bottom up with kind of soft buy-in, if you like, rather than legislation. I think that I certainly would not support anything like a framework directive or this kind of legislation that some stakeholders might talk about. I think where we do need legislation is in terms of the right conditions for research. It's getting the right EU copyright directive. It's getting the right EU data protection regulation. It's getting the right EU pension system. So it's getting the right legislatory and regulatory frameworks in place for research. But then you don't, I think, legislate in terms of what researchers and research organisations do and how they do it.
So look at some of those barriers. For example, mobility. You mentioned pensions. Look at the barrier, and there is, of course, an initiative in that area. I think it's called Resaver. Is that right? Look at those barriers and then see what needs to be done very specifically to get that regulatory environment right, but a broader legislation not.
Exactly.
Agrita, for you, as I say, I've read council conclusions that suggest this is not the way ministers are thinking, not thinking legislatively. Is that right?
Well, yes. I was also pleased to hear the reflection on why the Lisbon things failed.
Yes.
Because we concentrated on creating new legislations, new institutions, when we have to concentrate on changing culture and finding new ways of working. And I would agree here.
Thank you. I want to come back to that point about culture, because you mentioned it at the beginning and it's very, very central. But any other questions or comments to what you have heard? Yes, please. And then to you, sir. I'll take a few this time.
So one of the problems that we experience often across Europe, and this is related to the Charter for Access to Research Infrastructures, is different policies at a national level that prevent, for example, research organizations to transfer technology and services to industry and SMEs. So we see that in some countries this is possible, and this is also an incentive and a mechanism for extra sustainability of the research system. In other countries this is not possible because the legislation doesn't allow publicly funded research to deliver services in order not to create unfair competition in the market, and that limits the possibilities of service transfer, technology transfer. And so on one end, research is pushed towards innovation more and more, but on the other end, that's very difficult to implement. So
there is a legislative barrier in terms of, as you say, those different systems, which is leading to the fragmentation which you identified.
So the question is the digital single market in its roadmaps going to address the problem, this problem?
Thank you very much. Please.
Yes. Everyone thinks that, I think there is consensus that ERC is a very successful model. And yet, in many European countries, there are similar programs as the ERC in the sense of bottom-up calls that fund the best ideas. What do you think, because I think it would be very good for a European research area, of pulling the resources of all the member states and channeling them to a big ERC that will be a single one for the whole Europe?
Okay, thanks very much. Any others before I come back? Okay, if I can pick up, and Ian, I'll ask you as UK research councils, do you want to be pooled, if I can put it that way? I think I know where he's going to go with this.
I think it's the shorter of the two possible answers, actually, probably at the moment. I think there is a point, actually. I'm not just looking at the UK, but I mean, research councils in individual countries, they are looking at research which is both of international value but also of national value, and I think we're closer, certainly at the moment, closer to the issues and the policies and the priorities within a country. And I think there's a certain aspect of research which will be related to the position that a country sees itself in, the sort of industries it has, and it's that level of working. And I think it's not quite I mean, it may be that in future there's a different configuration of the way research is in Europe, but excellence underpins it all. But I think there is a sense in which it's related to the priorities within that state as well.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that, Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I also think, I mean, I completely agree with Ian, but I also think that, you know, as I said before, I think you need strong national systems in order to have a strong European system. And I think if everything's done through one big European competition, how do we deal with the fact the reality that the lion's share of the funding may go to a few countries? You know, how do we deal with that issue of diversity, of that issue of differing research capabilities? And I think different countries need to be allowed to develop the funding schemes, whether they're bottom-up or top-down, that work for their national situation, and allow them to develop their own capabilities, their own infrastructures, their own research training, and so on and so forth. So I think there is, whilst it's an interesting idea, I think the reality is there's a potential to really weaken the 28 national systems by doing that.
Other thoughts on that, Agrita?
I guess my thoughts are concerted with this. I think that would be disaster, unless we find how to change the concept of excellence towards the inclusive excellence, because the concept per se is exclusive, and it is about the club, and it is about the club of the elite safeguarding itself. So the concept of having resources pooled at the EU 28 level is exactly about that. So I think national research systems are crucial, really, to make sure that the whole of the Europe develops, not just its core.
Okay. Helena? And can I ask you now, so we also addressed the other question, you talked about fragmentation at the beginning, but you also talked about no legislation. The point there about a lack of harmonised rules for governing certain things is making it harder to be a genuinely European research area.
No. We don't need more harmonisation. What we do need is to pursue a common goal of improvement. Now, let me come back to this question about being pulled or not pulled. I would say that a very interesting example is what has happened with the funding of research at European level in the weaker economies. And I am Portuguese. So I think we have felt it, that what happened to the most successful universities or research institutions that have managed to have money from European money, the Portuguese government say, well, you have got already enough money from Europe, so we can keep some back. So this is a very not good example, or an example of not so good practices. And with this pull together resources, I'm very much afraid that what we will end up with is with islands of excellence, the crème de la crème in Europe, forgetting that to have the cream, you need the milk. So we need good quality research systems, not islands. 3 islands, perhaps, 4 islands. This morning, Luke was speaking about 28 minus 22.
And just on that point, you were very categorical there in your answer on the legislation question, but how do we address, can you expand a little bit more on how you address the fragmentation and how you address issues like that one raised by the audience?
Well, a way of addressing the fragmentation would be indeed to look for excellence, but also to look for the basic quality of the systems, not just to put all your assets in one box. Okay? There are different boxes with different capabilities.
Okay. Can I just ask another question? I'm just thinking, when we talk about the process and what we need to do, we have heard a lot, we heard it from Commissioner Moedas yesterday and from Vice President Katainen this morning, about getting the results of research to market. And I take your point about that balance between the two things. But I'm just wondering, as part of this, are there other new types of stakeholders that need to be involved in this process if we are going to address that issue? Or is it just something that the existing group of stakeholders, convened in the ways you've all described, can address together, and there isn't a gap, if you like? There's no one who should be round the table and isn't at the moment. Just to address, because that's been mentioned by everybody and is a overriding, you talked about impact earlier, Ian, an overriding preoccupation. In the EU, we don't quite have the impact. We have the excellence, but do we have the commercialization? Not as often as we should.
Absolutely. Actually, in the UK, we always say, however good it might look at the moment, we're not happy with it. It's not good enough. I can reflect. It sort of relates to this point about an innovation organisation. And we have in the UK created in recent years an organisation which is called Innovate UK. But it came about not just by being created just like that. It evolved out of discussions around technology strategies, and we have a thing called 8 Great Technologies, which was a real, our ministers love these sort of things. But the point actually is that we have an organisation which actually its focus is on that interface between universities and business and how to make that work. Yeah. They have things they call catapult centres and things. I'm not going to go into detail, but the point is they're looking at the research that's happening. It's funded by research councils, funded by others in the UK, and also looking at the business side and saying, how do you effectively get that interaction?
And are there different players around that table to some of the more traditional stakeholder platforms we've been talking about, or is it the same people, same types of people looking at the issue in a different way, if you see what I mean?
I could say slightly flippantly, because some of the people are exactly the same people, because the people I've seen involved in the system before, but it's the new structures that bring them together to focus on the problems in a different way.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this question? Yes, please, Agrita.
Well, probably we have to look at the different and new stakeholders, and some in what we've discovered along the way of our smart specialization exercise have been working with young scientists. And both organized and unorganized. If we look at the different ecosystems around the question, then we've been trying to identify players and bring them on the board, and we've been also strategically trying to bring in people who would question the established members, and in that we could balance out the interests, and we could also get new perspectives in.
Thank you. Helena.
Yes, just a quick comment on the need for more stakeholders. I would say that what we need is an increased trust amongst the stakeholders. We need to build trust amongst ourselves. And let me speak a little bit about universities and business.
Yes, please.
This is an issue that is fulcral, absolutely essential to get research results to the market. And to have a successful collaboration, you need to have the mutual trust, and that takes time. You don't achieve it in 1 year. So there is no point in going around looking for 1,000 industries to collaborate with you. You need to build your own network and build trust in it.
And I'm glad you raised that, because coming to this cultural issue, and the Minister talked earlier about equal partnership and that being very important, what for you is the key? And we're talking about different cultures, the business world, the science, the research world, the policy world. What to you is the key to building that trust and the essential elements if it is to be perceived by all those involved as a genuine equal partnership?
Well, our experience at UA tells us that one of the things that is needed is continuity of working together. That's one thing. The other thing that we see as important is to promote amongst our youngsters the risk-taking culture. Do not be afraid to fail. Learn from your failures. Do not punish people. And in Europe, we are very prone to punish failures and not promote a risk-taking culture.
Absolutely. Amanda, you talked about soft buy-in earlier. How do you get that soft buy-in?
I think that there's no quick fix to it. It's through a long period of deep collaboration and dialogue. I mean, just to give you a sort of a couple of concrete examples, I mean, at Science Europe, what we did is we set up working groups which are comprised of experts on various topics from across our member organisations to address key issues like open access, research integrity, cross-border collaboration. And what we find in setting up new groups is they're kind of quite slow to sort of come to sort of products and concrete outcomes, if you like, because the first thing you have to do is spend the first year, essentially, having the discussion about what perspectives everybody comes from, what does everybody mean when they say research integrity, what exists in the different countries, and there simply is no quick way to do that. You've got to actually just sit down together round a table, get to know each other, and get to understand where people are coming from.
You make an important point, and you don't make assumptions about where they're coming from.
No, absolutely.
That's central. And Ian, you talked about persuading people to do these things. What for you? When you're in salesman mode about cooperation, collaboration, making a European research area work, what do you say to people when they say we had quite a lot of conversation about what's in it for me? Why can't I just do my own thing in my laboratory, in my area? What do you say when you're in sales pitch mode about how we create this culture?
Well, actually, the point you say there, it happens exactly. We all see this in either countries or universities or individual research groups say, yeah, we're focusing on our research and that's what matters.
Go away and leave us alone.
Yeah. But I think the point is to actually help people to understand that there is a bigger picture to things, and that the sum of all these excellent parts is not necessarily as big as it could be unless we really do have that connectivity, the awareness of what else is going on. If you're going to work across boundaries, you have to be aware of something. So one person has to go more than halfway. You have to be outward looking, thinking more about that. I think that happens at all levels. So I don't have a full answer.
It's very striking because we've talked quite a lot. The word graphene has been mentioned a lot over the last 2 days, and I recently moderated a discussion on that, and I asked the scientists what they wanted from the policymakers, and they said, just leave us alone. Let us get on with it, and we will deliver your dream, as it were. And Greta, what do you say when you hear that from researchers and scientists from a ministry perspective? Because we've talked about how important it is to bring everyone together, but the natural inclination just might be, please let me get on with my fabulous, groundbreaking research and go away, if you like.
Well, I tell in those moments, and they are quite often, I must say, we tell that our role as policymakers is to, roll out the red carpet for them.
Oh, nice.
And help them and enable them. So, and that's how you kind of break in. But I would like to go back to what you said about the trust and ask about the trust building. I think it's looking into each other's eyes, agreeing on what we will do and then do, and really do.
Yeah.
And in that perspective, I think there's quite a bit to be done because, we really go back, we do our thing, and we don't keep our promises. But if we do, then the things are different.
Yeah, so deliver. Do what you said. A couple of other issues I'd like to touch on before we conclude, but any other questions or comments to what you have heard from all of you before we start to begin to draw some conclusions from this session? No? Okay. I want to come back to the question of monitoring and evaluation, because we heard earlier, Maria Corsan said in the first session this morning, we need to show impact. The Minister talked about making visible progress. We need a better evaluation. How are we going to? We're talking about completing ERA. How are we going to know when we've done it, if I can put it that way? When we're at the end of the first chapter and we can move into taking full advantage of it. What for all of you how are we going to measure the success of what we're doing? What for you, Helena, is the sort of definition that it really is working in the way that it should?
God, that's the 1 million question. I don't know, $1 million question. What I would like to say is that when you start being worried about understanding the other expectations, that's when I can think that things are going to start working. When you try to understand, not only trusting amongst the different stakeholders, but try to understand what are the expectations.
Yeah. Okay. Ian, you talked about impact earlier. How do you in the UK measure that impact? What lessons can we draw from that at the European level? Do we need now, as part of this process, a new set of indicators of how we're doing, or?
Yeah, I mean, actually, impact is a very, very hard one, actually. I think the problem, actually, I think I see, and I say this from having seen some of the work that's been done through Iraq on indicators. It's actually very hard to come up with this sort of the perfect indicator that tells you that everything is going along properly. I mean, a good example actually in the UK. I mean, it seems an obvious thing to say. Well, actually, if you produce a lot of PhD students with really high skills, you expect them to have an impact out in industry. So how do you get it? Well, you just go and ask them, don't you? No. Well, it doesn't really give the easy answer. You have to really think very hard on what it is that you measure. And
I mean, is it about numbers of scientific papers? Is it about numbers of patent? Often the figure you see is about patent applications. And people saying, oh, well, we're not making as many. We have the excellent science. We don't have the same rate. Is it things like that, or is that too simplistic?
I think that the problem with indicators, I think a lot of people would say, is if you say your indicator is the number of patent applications or the number of papers, then people will respond by having more patent applications and more papers. But you can actually get that without actually having any more impact. So in terms of the papers one, it's not just the publishing of the papers, it's the fact that they're used. It was mentioned yesterday about some of Einstein papers were never actually quoted until people started quoting them because they hadn't been quoted before. So it's actually about what use is made of that material, that information, the people, the knowledge, etc. That's what you're really getting to, I think.
Thank you. Greta, your minister talked about visible progress. How will it be visible? How will we be able to prove that we're getting bang for bucks, that we're really delivering? Because you talked about delivery being the key to acceptance.
Right. Probably it's not going to happen in a couple of years, but I would imagine that we can say that ERA is complete when we do not talk anymore about inbreeding.
Inbreeding
in universities, that when that is removed from European...
I think I need clarification on what we're talking about here.
Well, that's the concept of hiring your own graduates. When that is gone, I think we have ERA, and that's, I would say that would be a fairly simple measure to measure.
When we have genuine mobility of researchers within and between member states, that will show us that it is working.
Even between the neighbor universities. Once we stop hiring our graduates, I think we have ERA.
Okay, thank you very much. Amanda, for you, how are we going to measure this?
I think before I answer the question about measurement, I'd just like to challenge something you yourself said, because you just said at the beginning of this, we're all talking about completing ERA. And I just want to stress the point that we're not talking about completing ERA. This is something that within Science Europe we're strongly against, because we think the notion of completing something that's essentially ongoing and long-term and evolving is quite nonsensical. I mean, if you just look at the open science debate that we had yesterday, a lot of the things being discussed weren't on the table a year ago or 2 years ago, and now we're discussing policy in the relation to of them. And it may sound quite a pedantic and quite a semantic point, but I think this constant reference to the completion of something that doesn't need completing as such isn't hugely helpful.
So this is a journey without end.
It is a journey without end, and we should see it as a journey without end. And of course we should make progress in certain things. But I think, I don't think it's a failure if we can't say last year or this year or next year ERA is complete, because essentially it doesn't mean anything.
Okay, take your point, but don't we need some targets and some goals? And then I'll come to you, sir. Otherwise, we just, as I say, we have a nice conversation about what we need to do, and then we all come back next year and have the same conversation?
Some individual targets. We should basically make sure that we get a good copyright directive for Europe. We should make sure that, you know, where we have agreed that things are going to be harmonised, that actually happens. We should make sure that the objectives that appear in the various policy documents are met. But I don't think that's the same as completing ERA, and
Okay.
I do think that's a really
Thank you very much for that
important point.
distinction. You wanted to come in, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'm Riccardo Pozzo, National Research Council of Italy. We are starting in Italy an evaluation of third mission, that is impact, and I also think that ERA is an ongoing process. My question is, we have technological innovation, we have social innovation. How about finding indicators for cultural innovation? This is a big problem we have right now. That is, and that's right what Mrs. Crawford was saying. We are in front of an ongoing process, and what we have had in Horizon 2020 is reflective societies. It's a very big progress.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We are almost out of time, and I do want to try and just draw some conclusions from this session. I was going to ask you for your priority for action to complete the European research area, but I am going to stand corrected and say, I'm going to put it a different way. Let's call it a fully fledged European research area, which, as you say, would still have to go on and to adapt. The roadmap, of course, has the 6 headlines, the 8 top priorities, but and the Minister said earlier, there is no single path to complete ERA. Now, taking that as a given, so this is a very unfair question, but nevertheless, in my experience, politicians really like sort of, what do you want me to do? What do I need to do next? So if we can use that horrible American expression, the elevator pitch. I'm sure you're all familiar with the elevator pitch. You're in an elevator, the elevator stops on the 2nd floor, in gets the commissioner and presses the button for the 5th floor. So you've only got, because sometimes in answer this, people say to me, oh, it's a very tall building when they give me 10 priorities. No, only going from the 2nd to the 5th floor. So that's, that's all the time you've got to tell the commissioner what you really, really want and need to happen. So for each of you, what would your elevator pitch be? But then I'll give you more time to explain why. If you had to identify one priority to make sure that we move closer to a fully fledged ERA, what for each of you would it be and why? And I will start with you, Agrita, this time, and we'll just go down the line.
Well, that would be simple. It would be equal pay.
Can you expand on why you think that is the most important priority of them all?
Well, because if you want people move, and not only one direction, they have to be paid the same everywhere.
Okay.
And that's
So,
probably...
so this is equal pay between the different member states, not so much equal pay, there's a gender equality session elsewhere. That's not your thinking. It's about making sure...
I would say it doesn't matter whether you pay differently to different genders or different sexual orientations or different races or different countries. The mechanism is exactly the same. And if we get that one thing straight, then again, people can move.
Okay, thank you very much. Helena, what for you is the most important thing they need to do?
We have been fighting and the battle of trying to say there is no innovation without research. I would say there is no innovation without excellent research, be it applied or fundamental. And now today I heard something that I want to stress. We need education. We need the triangle. It's innovation, research and education. Without education, forget about innovation. It's not that it is impossible, but it's highly improbable.
Okay. And in terms of where we go with that education, what do we need to do? What needs fixing?
Well, universities need appropriate and adequate funding. I'm sorry, this is very basic, but it is essential. Without funding and funding that is stable.
Absolutely crucial. Ian, for you, the most important priority now, where do we need to focus?
I think, to be honest, it's about maintaining openness in all that we do. I absolutely go with what the Commissioner was saying about that. I think openness in terms of people moving, in terms of ideas moving. It's getting over those barriers, because that's what I think is what's enabled us to do what we do in the UK.
Okay, and to do that, to achieve that, concretely, what can we do?
Well, I think I'll pick one example from the areas that I know well, which in terms of recruitment of people, recruitment of researchers. You have to do that openly. It addresses the inbreeding point that was being made. If you want to be able to attract excellence, and to do that, you need to be able to have people move and encourage them to move. So mobility is not the objective; it's the means to the end of that open system whereby people and ideas are interacting.
Thank you very much. Mandy, you have the last word.
I do, and unfortunately somebody's already said what I was going to say.
Well, that just shows, that makes Ian's job much easier in the next session when I ask him to identify what the priorities were.
But I'll give you another one that comes to mind off the top of my head, which is going back to this issue of the conditions for research. And, you know, everybody sitting in this room today is here because they're interested in ERA, they're a stakeholder in ERA. But actually, a lot of decisions that impact research are made by bodies that are not in the room. You know, they're made by finance committees, they're made by budget committees. You know, if we look at data protection, it's being debated in the Parliament, not by the research committee, and so on. So I think what we actually need is a wider dialogue where we're all collectively supporting research in the bigger landscape, so research isn't adversely impacted by decisions that are made outside of it.
So this new approach with the new European Commission, for example, where we have a new structure designed to break down those silos and to make sure that we have joined up thinking, if we can put it, that for you, take account. What was the one of the other, when you said someone had stolen your priority, which was it?
It was Helena's point about research, innovation and education.
Right. So education. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed for such a frank and I think very useful, Peter, for you in terms of as you look to what needs to happen next, very rich and very useful discussion. Thank you very much.